all of these reasons like are BS and can easily be refuted. And the frustrating thing about the Biden administration is they don't talk about it at all. Like they just pretend Cuba doesn't exist, the blockade doesn't exist. And when they've been asked by journalists about why is, Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism, if you literally met with them earlier this month to negotiate like anti-terrorism cooperation, because Cuba has always cooperated with the US, like having those diplomatic discussions, and they did earlier this month. They had talks in Havana, and what the government responds is, oh, the regime has a long history of repression, and then like completely deflects the question and will like move on to someone else in the press room. That happened a couple weeks ago with Liz Fernandez, a journalist from Belly of the Beast who is visiting the US from Cuba. So clearly, like, they know that they cannot justify this or the blockade at all. So they just count on us not knowing about it or not caring, which is why it's so important. We're talking about why, we need to take Cuba off the list, why Cuba is not a state sponsor of terrorism, and why the US is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world, and that's our real enemy.
Hello everyone, it's your host Tony. Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism. What you just heard is a snippet of this episode's discussion. If you're a new listener, this show is a podcast dedicated to exploring past, present, and future manifestations of real-world socialism by speaking to those who studied extensively, lived in, or currently live in a socialist nation. Today, I'll be continuing my discussion on Cuba with Calla, Walsh, and Aeron, who are representatives of the National Network on Cuba, the NNOC. The NNOC is a coalition of over 50 organizations across the U.S. working together to end the U.S. blockade on Cuba. The focus of this second and final part of our conversation is to examine the absurd imperialist rationales and devastating impacts of Cuba's placement on the U.S. State Department's state sponsor of terror list. And we'll also be looking at what the NNOC and other Cuba solidarity orgs are doing to specifically get Cuba removed from that list. If you haven't already, you can check out the first part of our discussion where Calla and Aeron really lay down a whole set of ways we can all stand in solidarity with Cuba and why it's vital and necessary for us as leftists to do so. On June 25th, 2023, there will be protests happening across North America regarding the removal of Cuba from the state sponsor of terrorism list. Do check out the NNOC's website, which is nnoc.org, to learn not only more about this upcoming event, but find more information in regards to what you can do to stand in solidarity with Cuba. This show is 100% listener funded, so if you do wish to contribute as a subscriber, you will gain access to a variety of bonus episodes and content. Shout out to my patrons. If you're unable to contribute, no worries. You can help out by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AES the Podcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Feel free to leave a review if you have time. And while you're at it, you can check out the back catalog of episodes as well. So something which has complicated not only the Cuban blockade, but as you've talked about having American citizens get there, is Cuba being placed again on what is called the state sponsor of terror list by the U.S. government. Could you explain what this list is and why Cuba was placed on it in the first place?
So Cuba was first placed on the state sponsors of terrorism list in 1982 by Ronald Reagan. He cited Cuba's support for anti-colonial, anti-apartheid movements as reasons that they were terrorist. And obviously, just the term terrorist is so politicized and weaponized by the US state. It's never used to refer towards the war crimes and mass genocides that the US is carrying out. It's only used to demonize and dehumanize enemies of US imperialism, to manufacture consent for invading them or blockading them. And it's even applied against, BLM protesters, against Stop Cop City protesters, anyone that the US, wants to criminalize. And that's exactly what they're doing with Cuba. So Cuba stayed on this list until the era of the Obama administration, when he started to normalize US-Cuba relations in his second term. And when talking about Obama policy towards Cuba, I think it's important to remember Obama was still against the Cuban Revolution and still against Cuba's sovereignty. He simply saw that the blockade was not working at overthrowing the Cuban Revolution, so he wanted to choose a different set of tactics. And while he did, take important steps to normalize relations, to restore diplomatic relations, to, have direct flights from the US to Cuba, he was still continuing all of the covert CIA programs to overthrow the Cuban Revolution. But that said, there were really good impacts during this period for US and Cuban people through the increased exchange between our two populations. And Trump, once he got in office, he pretty much undid almost everything Obama had put in place to better relations. He added 243 new additional sanctions, really cruel, punitive measures. And of course, this is when COVID is taking off. So it put a huge strain on Cuba's economy. And then on January 11th, 2021, 4 days after the January 6th insurrection, just like a week before Trump left office, he and Mike Pompeo decided to add Cuba back to the state sponsors of terrorism list. And this is really just like out of cruel spite for Cuba and for socialist countries. But it was also, a political move to kind of set up a tricky situation for Biden where he would be getting pressure from both sides to either take Cuba off the list or keep Cuba on the list, which is exactly what is happening now. What this list is, it is a list created and maintained only by the US, but it has immense influence over Cuba's economy, over Cuba's ability to participate in international trade, because the US has huge influence over the international financial system. And so what it does is really exacerbating all the already existing and devastating effects of the US blockade. So, it prevents Cuba from participating in international trade, from getting loans from the World Bank, from getting US foreign assistance, from exporting certain items. And it has also prevented Cuban Americans from sending money to their family in Cuba, from faith-based humanitarian groups in the US shipping supplies, medical supplies. It's kept US universities from working with Cuban academics and institutions. And a lot of international banks, they don't even want to, provide services to Cuba just in fear of retaliation by the US, because the US has sued other countries for hundreds of millions of dollars for violating US sanctions on Cuba. And so just the word terrorist being on that list, it scares a lot of countries and banks away from wanting to do business with Cuba, which is just evil. And it shows how extraterritorial the US blockade is. It's a violation of Cuba's sovereignty and democracy, and also like every other country in the world, which is why even close US allies like the UK, France, Canada, they vote to condemn the blockade every year in the United Nations. So Biden has not taken Cuba off the list despite pressure from us, from the Cuba Solidarity Movement, and from a lot of Cuban Americans who simply want to, be able to have normal relations with their family and send them things. Despite Biden also supporting Obama's normalization and promising to undo Trump's harshest measures during his campaign and promising to return to Obama-era policy. Right now, I also want to mention there is an effort by extreme right-wing Republicans in the House and Senate, Maria Salazar in the House and Marco Rubio in the Senate. They have introduced the Force Act, which would codify into law Cuba's designation as a state sponsor of terror. Because right now, this is a list maintained by the State Department. So Biden could essentially remove Cuba with the flick of a pen and change the designation, which is why we're focusing on this, as a pressure point. But this bill is trying to codify Cuba's position so that it could only be undone by Congress. And that would only happen if Cuba met these impossible conditions. It says Cuba can only be removed as a state sponsor of terrorism if Cuba, completely changes their political and economic system to be what the US determines as free. We talk about the blockade like it's one single thing, but it's actually like a whole mess, a complex amalgamation of hundreds of different laws and bills and packages of legislation. But many of these acts, they say the same things. They stipulate that sanctions can only be lifted if Cuba has fair and free elections overseen by the US, and if they essentially overthrow their current government as they know it. And that shows just how undemocratic the blockade is and how it is fundamentally aimed at, taking away Cuba's sovereignty and Cuba's right to decide their own system. It can only be what the US wants to impose upon Cuba. So we are pressuring Biden to take Cuba off the list. We're pressuring representatives to vote no on the Force Act, HR 314. And obviously, we're also demanding to lift all sanctions to normalize all relations. But we think this is a good pressure point, since it's something Biden, as of right now, could change on his own.
Not only is Cuba not a state sponsor of terrorism, they are a victim of terrorism. They have been a victim of real terrorism. Over 3,000 citizens have died in terrorist attacks. Planes have been brought down. Biological warfare has been used against their crops. So they lost they have varied areas to get currency. They have sugar, they have nickel, they have cobalt, they have tourism, they have remittances. These are the areas where Cuba gets hard currency. And these are the areas that the United States goes after and attacks, whether through economic sanctions or through violence, destroying the sugarcane crop, making sure they can't get parts for their tractors so they can't use it in agriculture to produce sugar. These are direct attempts to destroy the economy of Cuba, to force the people to break away from the revolution. That's their goal. They know the revolution is supported. So what they want to do is make the suffering so bad that the people say, no mas, we can't do this anymore. And that's what these sanctions are for, to create mass suffering and pain. And they are. They are. If it wasn't for the heroic resistance, solidarity, democracy, and compassion of the revolutionary people of Cuba, they would have collapsed a long time ago. And I will tell you, if Cuba wasn't any of those things, they would have collapsed. And that shows you the depth of the revolutionary process in Cuba. It shows the people's commitment to that revolutionary process, that it still survives after the continuous attacks and terrorism and sanctions and violence against that nation. That, to me, is historic. It's a historic process that we all have so much to learn from, the tenacity of the Cuban Revolution, their ability to stay joyful. The United States wants to remove Cuba's ability to have joy in their life, and I can tell you they have failed, and they will continue to fail.
Yeah, and that gets at a really important lie that we're told in the US about the blockade and about all sanctions that the US imposes on countries in general. Like, since the fall of the USSR, the use of sanctions by the US has grown exponentially as one of their main mechanisms to overthrow, undermine, destabilize countries, or to, destabilize them and then go and invade, like in the case of Iraq. But we're told that the blockade is only, and sanctions are only targeting the Cuban government or the Iraqi government, but really they're aimed at punishing the entire population, collective punishment. The stated purpose of the blockade in now public State Department documents from the early 1960s says it is aimed at creating hunger, desperation, and overthrow of government, exactly what Aeron was explaining. So it really is cruel, and the US will always, always say, we want to support the Cuban people, but they don't. They want to punish the Cuban people for, taking power into their own hands, for kicking out US neocolonialism. And just to go back to my earlier point, I realized you asked, about why Cuba is on the list, and I didn't fully explain like the up-to-date justifications the US uses for why Cuba is on the list. And I think that slipped my mind because the reasons are just such BS that like I don't even consider them like as valid. And it's just like so obvious to anyone who like knows about US Cuba history that Cuba is not a terrorist state and that Cuba has been a victim of US terrorism. But what the US uses as its justification for keeping Cuba on this list, Trump added them back in 2021, and he pointed to, one, the fact that Cuba holds US fugitives, that somehow that proves they're a terrorist state, which again is BS. The fugitives that Cuba is holding are political prisoners who have escaped persecution in the US, like Assata Shakur, who is living safely in freedom, liberated on liberated land in Cuba, free from persecution in the US. And even if there were like actual like bad prisoners or whatever that Cuba was holding, like that's not a justification for labeling them as a state sponsor of terrorism. Like when Roman Polanski fled to France fleeing child sex abuse charges, the US didn't call France a state sponsor of terrorism or slap them with a 60-year blockade. And then other reasons that the US uses is the role that Cuba has played in the peace process in Colombia, negotiations between the Colombian government and the ELN, a guerrilla group. And Cuba has been praised internationally for their role in these peace talks, which have actually like created huge progress for the situation in Colombia. And it wasn't just Cuba participating in these talks, like it was the Vatican, it was like Norway, like US allies. In 2019, there was a bombing of a police station in Colombia, and Cuba didn't extradite the ELN members in Cuba, as was agreed upon by the peace treaty process and their negotiations. So they weren't like violating anything. And now there's a progressive government, not, a right-wing like US client regime in Colombia. And this new progressive government has repeatedly condemned the blockade, said Cuba is not a terrorist state. How could Cuba be a terrorist state if they are helping like create a peaceful solution to the violence we're facing in Colombia? And they've called for, Biden to take them off the list and to unblock Cuba. So all of these reasons like are BS and can easily be refuted. And the frustrating thing about the Biden administration is they don't talk about it at all. Like they just pretend Cuba doesn't exist, the blockade doesn't exist. And when they've been asked by journalists about why is, Cuba a state sponsor of terrorism, if you literally met with them earlier this month to negotiate like anti-terrorism cooperation, because Cuba has always cooperated with the US, like having those diplomatic discussions. And they did earlier this month, they had talks in Havana. And what the government responds is, oh, the regime has a long history of repression, and then like completely deflects the question and will like move on to someone else in the press room. That happened a couple weeks ago with Liz Fernandez, a journalist from Belly of the Beast who is visiting the US from Cuba. So clearly, like, they know that they cannot justify this or the blockade at all. So they just count on us not knowing about it or not caring, which is why it's so important. We're talking about why, we need to take Cuba off the list, why Cuba is not a state sponsor of terrorism, and why the US is the biggest state sponsor of terrorism in the world. And that's our real enemy.
The United States allows its citizens in the hundreds of thousands to sleep rough on streets. It allows its citizens to die of preventable diseases because it's not profitable to cure them. To think that they would act any different around the world, they act just as bad or worse. I will remind you that in Georgia last month, a schizophrenic person who was imprisoned was eaten alive by bugs in prison in the United States. The United States has no standing to tell anybody about any human rights at all. So, and I think that we as Americans, United Statesians, I should say, because America is the Western Hemisphere of the Americas, have an obligation to point out the utter hypocrisy and cruelty of our own government to its own citizens at every step of the way. United States, is this you? Picture umpteenth million things that we can point out to. This is our response to them anytime the United States talks about another nation's human rights. This country has no, as my mother would say, you haven't paid for the milk you suck yet, United States. This country has no standing to talk to other nations about that until it cleans up its own backyard, which is a mess. It's a dumpster fire here. That's how I would respond to any of that. United States, clean up your mess before you go talking about other people. It's about cruelty. It's cruelty. And it's designed to get a couple electoral college votes out of a couple counties in Florida. I think there's more to it than that, but that plays a part. Can you imagine? That's what we're doing. It's political games to people, but it's utter cruelty to entire populations. It's to win some votes so Marco Rubio can show his bona fides to certain constituents that give him money. That's what this is about. And it means people in dire desperation for, a constituency.
Yeah, and I just add to that, it's not just right-wing extreme like Miami Republicans, it's also the Democratic Party. There was just an article in the Washington Post because obviously Biden is getting a lot of pressure about the situation at the border, the mass flows of migration, which are a result of US wars, of US neocolonialism, US-backed violent right-wing dictatorships, and US sanctions. So a group of quote-unquote progressive Democrats wrote a letter urging Biden to ease sanctions on Venezuela and Cuba in order to, slow the flow of migration to the US border. And in this article, it was talking about Bob Menendez, who's I think the chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee or like a high up leader in that committee or whatever, and about how he is basically the principal roadblock to Biden changing his Cuba policy. And this all is coming from like people inside the White House and the State Department who are saying this. But it's because Biden needs Menendez to get his committee appointments through the Senate. So he's not going to piss him off by changing Cuba policy because he doesn't care about millions of Cubans who are suffering under sanctions. He cares about his own image and getting, his appointments through or whatever. So it is also the Democratic Party, and clearly like that showing the contradictions because these sanctions are creating more crises for Biden that he's getting domestic pressure from on the right and the left. But it is not at the will of the US people that these sanctions are being continued. It is a small sect, a small extreme sect of the US ruling class who is our enemy that we need to defeat.
The point of that is so wonderful about the democratic process here versus the democratic process in Cuba. The process in Cuba is your constituents are the people, right? So you answer to the people in Cuba, because the people of Cuba love also, they're very vociferous. They're not a meek people. Here, you answer to your political constituents, right? This is a fundamentally different system. So you answer to the people that help get you elected, not to the general population, not to the population. It's a very different system with vastly different outcomes. One informs a system that helps an entire population, that the entire population is the constituency. And the other one is a very narrow one, where you need to get an appointment through, where you need to get a vote on, whether the tar sands are going to be drilled. That's how the American system works. That system is, by its nature, a corrupting, influence peddling system. It's not a reformable system. We have a lot to learn about democracy from places like Cuba.
The other countries that are on the state sponsor of terror list are Iran, North Korea, and Syria. All three of these countries are normally depicted as, having spooky Muslim terrorists who are planning to attack the U.S. domestically in some way. How does Cuba then fit in with that kind of narrative of it being a direct assault on the U.S.? Is there some kind of strange justification that connects to those actions?
I'm not an expert on any of those other countries, nor am I an expert on Cuba, but I know more about Cuba than I do about Iran or Syria or the DPRK. But all of these countries are victims of US sanctions and US-backed wars. And that is the real question. And obviously that is why the US is trying to demonize them and to place them as outliers and isolate them internationally by labeling them as terrorists. But I would say, if you are reading off a list of those 4 countries that are on the list to the average US person that you walk by on the street, obviously they'd be like, oh, why is Cuba on there? Because Iran, Syria, the DPRK, those countries have been in the news a lot recently, and the US war machine is always manufacturing consent to escalate sanctions, to start wars with these countries. But Cuba, it's more on the back burner. I think that's kind of the difference, is that the blockade is so long and enduring that it's not even a question. Of course Cuba is a terrorist state, of course Cuba should be blockaded. That's kind of just the logic that the extreme duration of the US war on Cuba has created. But it's not as recent. It's essentially a continuation of this historical grudge against Cuba for overthrowing US neocolonialism. But it's not just a grudge, it's also in the interest of the US ruling class to continue blockading and sanctioning Cuba. And it's an interest of US pharmaceutical companies that life-saving Cuban medicines don't come and get distributed to the US people. So it goes a lot deeper too.
The one thing that Cuba has exported to the world more than anything else is its example. And that's what's most threatening to the United States, is that it's an example of doing something different. A sovereign nation that is truly sovereign in the sense that it's making its decisions without the interference of the United States, or at least without the connivance of the United States. The United States interferes all the time. But its example is what is so threatening. It's that it sends its doctors instead of bombs to other countries. That's the threat to the United States, right? This idea that a country has its own agency outside of the dictates of the United States. That is the most threatening thing. And that's what needs to be, I think it's a holdover from the anti-colonial struggles and the struggles, but Cuba is always an example. You will see pictures of Che and the Cuban flag in demonstrations in Bolivia, in Peru, in Colombia, in South Africa. Why? Because Cuba is an example, and that example is a threat to the United States. I will say this also about the sanctions. I think that the United States, folks in the United States that are organizing for a better world, that are committed into organizing, need to look seriously at organizing against the sanction regimes around the world. The sanctions now are the low-cost but brutal way of the United States to intervene. And I think that it's easy to say, oh, new sanctions passed and we move on in the United States, even us in the left and informed and stuff like that. But those sanctions mean mass starvation, forced immigration, children that won't get milk. I mean, real dire situations. And we need to treat them for what they are. They are acts of war against the people. We need to see it in the left as acts of war, and we need to confront it as an act of imperial aggression. I remember in 2001, we had a demonstration of hundreds of thousands against the Iraq war, which was imminent with the bombs. But that war was going on through a sanctions regime that killed more people than those bombs did. We need to organize like we did around the bombs that we do against sanctions to stop them being able to use this. The rest of the world is coming around with the kind of this attempted de-dollarization and stuff like that. But the United States is going to have a say on all that. And we need to be there as they de-dollarize their economies and create solidarity through our own protest movements against sanctions in the United States.
Just to add on a tiny bit, I think the proximity of Cuba to the US adds to the threat that it poses to US empire, because we've been told these things like free healthcare, free education, like abortion rights enshrined in the Constitution. We've been told our entire lives that that is impossible, but Cuba shows us it exists literally 90 miles away from the US. And so that's why they're slapped with such extreme sanctions. But I think Cuba's proximity to the US is also like a benefit to us in some ways, because the other countries on the list, like Iran, Syria, DPRK, most people in the US have never and will never travel to those countries. Probably a lot of people in the US don't even know anyone like from those countries, whereas Cuba, like we can travel there, we can see the reality. So I think in some ways like that will, I hope, make it easier to explain to people like the Cuban reality. And obviously I'm not like justifying the other countries being on the list. The list should not exist. The State Department should not exist. Like we should take them all off. But as a Cuba solidarity organization, like we're focusing on Cuba's position on the list and trying to get them off the list. But it's really important to us too that we're standing in solidarity with other movements against imperialism, whether it is in Palestine, whether it is in the DPRK, in Iran, in Syria, all over Latin America, with indigenous nations in the US. And that is Cuba's example. Cuba is like the heart of internationalism, and Cuba has sacrificed so much to aid liberation struggles around the world. And so we're focusing on getting Cuba off the list, but we stand with Iran, Syria, the DPRK, every single country that is a victim of US imperialism and that is resisting it.
So a big, aspect of our discussion today has been about the examples socialist countries, particularly Cuba, give out to the rest of the world. And, there's too many ways to, compare the expressions of socialism and capitalism, whether it's the pace of life in Cuba you talked about, who holds wealth, values, healthcare, homelessness, how mental health is treated. One example that I can think of is talking about the Soviet Union. So during the Cold War, of course, there was a real fear of nuclear war breaking out. And so both nations, the US and the Soviet Union, they came up with ways to defend themselves in some way. And the US government's focus when it came to this was what's called their continuity of government plans, where essentially they had a series of secret bunkers and an operational plan for if, half the US is destroyed by nuclear weapons, this political figure is going to go there, this other political figure will go here. And when it came to the Soviet Union, they didn't just have a plan for the leaders of the Soviet Union. They'd actually created enough bunkers to hold most of the people that lived in the Soviet Union. And right now, actually, there's abandoned bunkers that could house like hundreds and thousands of people that are just lying around. But that's just like a clear example of, the different values that are expressed in terms of, the care for the people rather than care for the capitalists. So what are Cuban solidarity organizations doing? Kind of mentioned the June 25th event, which is coming up. Could you talk about that in more detail? What are these organizations doing to get Cuba removed from the state sponsor of terror list?
The NNOC has been leading an off-the-list campaign this entire year. We're really mobilizing for these June 25th protests, but that's not the end of the campaign. Obviously, we'll see what the results of these protests are. We have been organizing on many different fronts, preparing, working with our member organizations and doing a lot of media work because, the battle of ideas is really increasingly being fought on social media. The US spends millions of dollars, like CIA bots on Twitter, whatnot, trying to promote counter-revolution in Cuba. And so we're, as Aeron was saying earlier, getting on there, like correcting the facts, educating people on the state sponsors of terrorism list, building a broader coalition outside of people who are already, politically conscious. And these June 25th protests, we're organizing for a rally at the White House, but there will be protests across the US, across Canada, across the world. You can find all the information at nnoc.org/off-the-list. Soon there will be a map of all the protests going on. That's where you can register for the different activities that whole weekend. You can sign up to, go lobby your congresspeople to not sign on to the Force Act, which I mentioned earlier. But this is a great way to start to get involved in the Cuba Solidarity movement. And we really are building a broad coalition of members of NNOC, but also like other organizations that we partner with. So the action is being supported by Code Pink, by the Answer Coalition, by IFCO Pastors for Peace, by the International People's Assembly, the Palestinian Youth Movement, the Alliance for Cuba Engagement and Respect, CPUSA, DSA, PSL, All African People's Revolutionary Party, and so many more that I'm not mentioning. There's a full list on our site, but if you're a part of an org, even if you're, not explicitly a Cuba-focused org, like we want you to support this action. We want to partner with you because we're not free till we're all free. And it's not always obvious like how Cuba and how imperialism is linked to all these struggles, but in reality, like they are all connected and it's all the same fight. So I really encourage people to get involved, to show up on June 25th, to meet people locally who are organizing for Cuba. And hopefully that can be a starting point to get involved in this work in the long term, to continue, organizing protests. This is a continuation of monthly rallies that have been happening around the year, initiated by Cuban Americans in the Puentes de Amor movement that have been happening for several years, of people who are against the blockade. And there's so much more work going on. People should come travel to Cuba, check out the NNOC website. We have info on a lot of upcoming trips. We have an interest form for the 2024 International Mayday Brigade if you want to go on the same trip that Aeron and I were on together. So there's many ways to get involved. And just working with the Cuban people, like traveling to Cuba, like meeting Cuban people who are living under sanctions every single day, but who have like the most revolutionary joy and hope and optimism. It will really change your life and it will really change like not only how you engage in your work with Cuba, but in all the organizing work you do. And honestly, like every single aspect like of your being, how you engage with like your family, your friends, how you treat your community, your neighbors.
No, thanks for that, Calla. And I'll give Aeron the last word here for us to wrap up.
Solidarity is the best medicine. We can do this. We have the ability to end the blockade, to get Cuba off the state sponsor of terrorism, and to build a better world in the process. And get involved. Sitting on the sidelines is not an option. All hands on deck. We need people to engage, be committed, find joy in their work, come together, connect, be curious. Go to meetings, talk to your neighbors, organize. On
that call to action, I'd like to say thank you so much, Calla and Aeron, for joining us on this show today, for talking in depth about what all of us individually can do, regardless of where we are in the world, to help the Cuban people and in turn, of course, help ourselves. Thanks again for joining the show.